Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who couldn't walk past someone in need. At 32, she worked as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Chicago, and her colleagues often joked that she had a radar for people in trouble. Whether it was a lost child in the grocery store or an elderly person struggling with heavy bags, Sarah would stop whatever she was doing to help. On that cold February morning, she was running late for her shift. The snowstorm the night before had made the roads treacherous, and her old Honda was struggling to get traction on the icy streets. She had already called the hospital to let them know she'd be 15 minutes behind schedule, something that made her stomach twist with guilt. Sarah prided herself on being punctual, and being late felt like letting her patients down. As she turned onto Maple Street, just 3 blocks from the hospital, she noticed something that made her slam on the brakes. There, collapsed on the sidewalk next to a bus stop, was an older man. Snow was beginning to accumulate on his worn military jacket, and he wasn't moving. Sarah's heart immediately started racing as she pulled her car to the curb, not even bothering to find a proper parking spot. She grabbed her emergency medical kit from the back seat and rushed through the ankle-deep snow toward the man. As she got closer, she could see he was probably in his 70s with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of a life filled with hard work. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and his lips had a concerning blue tint that Sarah recognized as a sign of hypothermia. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, kneeling beside him and gently shaking his shoulder. The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing confusion and fear. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper that Sarah couldn't quite make out over the wind. Without hesitation, Sarah began her assessment. She checked his pulse, which was weak but steady, and noticed that his left leg was positioned at an odd angle. It looked like he had fallen and possibly broken something. The temperature was dropping, and she knew that every minute counted if she was going to prevent his condition from getting worse. "I'm a nurse," she told him, hoping her voice would provide some comfort. "I'm going to help you, okay? What's your name?" The man managed to mumble something that sounded like Frank, and Sarah noticed the military patches on his jacket. He was wearing the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division, and there was a Vietnam War service ribbon pinned to his chest. Sarah immediately called 911, but when the dispatcher answered, she learned that all ambulances were currently responding to a multi-car accident on the interstate. The earliest an ambulance could reach them would be at least 45 minutes, maybe longer given the weather conditions. Frank was already showing signs of severe hypothermia, and Sarah knew that waiting that long could be fatal. She made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Frank, I'm going to get you somewhere warm," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure how she was going to manage it. The nearest hospital was where she worked, just a few blocks away, but Frank was a big man, probably close to 200 pounds, and she couldn't carry him that distance. Looking around frantically, Sarah spotted a construction site across the street, where a small bulldozer sat covered in snow. An idea began forming in her mind, though it seemed almost crazy. She had grown up on a farm in rural Illinois, and her father had taught her to operate various pieces of heavy machinery when she was just a teenager. She hadn't driven anything like that in years, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Sarah ran to her car and grabbed every blanket she had, along with her winter coat. She carefully wrapped Frank in the blankets, making sure to keep his potentially broken leg as stable as possible. "Frank, I need you to stay with me, okay?" she said, noting that his responses were becoming even weaker. "I'm going to get us out of here." She sprinted across the icy street to the construction site, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. The gate was unlocked, and the keys to the bulldozer were hanging on a hook in the small trailer office, probably left there by workers who had gone home early because of the storm. Sarah said a quick prayer as she climbed into the machine, hoping she could remember how to operate it. The engine roared to life on the third try, and Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. She had never stolen anything in her life, but she told herself that saving Frank's life was worth whatever legal consequences she might face. She carefully maneuvered the bulldozer out of the construction site and onto the street, where curious onlookers were beginning to gather. Getting Frank onto the bulldozer was the hardest part. Sarah had to use a combination of the machine's loader and her own strength to carefully lift him up without causing further injury to his leg. Throughout the process, Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, but she kept talking to him, telling him about her work at the hospital and promising that he was going to be okay. As they began their slow journey toward the hospital, Sarah realized that what she was doing probably looked completely insane to anyone watching. Here she was, a small woman in scrubs driving a stolen bulldozer through a snowstorm with an injured veteran as her passenger. But she also knew it was the right thing to do, and she was determined to see it through. The bulldozer moved slowly but steadily through the snow-covered streets. Sarah had to navigate around abandoned cars and fallen tree branches, all while making sure Frank remained as stable as possible. She could see the hospital in the distance, its lights cutting through the gray morning like a beacon of hope. What Sarah didn't know as she drove toward those lights was that her spontaneous act of heroism was being recorded by multiple people with cell phones, and that within hours, the footage would go viral across social media. She also didn't know that Frank's story was far more complicated than she could have imagined, or that their chance encounter would uncover secrets that had been buried for decades. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital erupted into controlled chaos when Sarah arrived on the bulldozer with Frank. Dr. Patricia Chen, who had been working there for 15 years, later said she had never seen anything like it. The sight of one of their own nurses pulling up on construction equipment with a patient was something that would be talked about in hospital corridors for years to come. Sarah had managed to radio ahead during the journey, so the trauma team was ready when they arrived. Within minutes, Frank was transferred onto a gurney and wheeled into the emergency department, where doctors immediately began working to stabilize his condition. Sarah followed closely behind, her scrubs now soaked with snow and her hands shaking from a combination of cold and adrenaline. Dr. Chen quickly assessed Frank's condition and confirmed what Sarah had suspected. He was suffering from moderate hypothermia, had a broken left fibula, and was severely dehydrated. However, what concerned the medical team most was his overall health status. Blood tests revealed that Frank was diabetic and his blood sugar levels were dangerously low. Without Sarah's intervention, he likely would have slipped into a diabetic coma within the hour. While Frank was being treated, hospital security and the police arrived to speak with Sarah about the bulldozer incident. She had expected this and was prepared to face whatever consequences came her way. Officer Miguel Rodriguez, who had been called to the scene, listened to her explanation with growing amazement rather than anger. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, "I've been a cop for 20 years and I've never written a report quite like this one. Technically, you did take someone else's equipment without permission, but given the circumstances..." He paused and looked through the window at Frank, who was now stable and resting. "I think we can work something out with the construction company." What happened next surprised everyone, including Sarah. When the construction company owner, Bob Harrison, arrived at the hospital after being notified about his missing bulldozer, he didn't come to press charges. Instead, he came to shake Sarah's hand. Bob, it turned out, was also a veteran, having served in the Gulf War, and when he learned what Sarah had done to save Frank, he was moved to tears. "That machine can be replaced," Bob told the gathering crowd of hospital staff and reporters who had begun to arrive. "A life can't be. What this young lady did today shows the kind of courage and quick thinking that we need more of in this world." Not only did Bob refuse to press charges, but he also announced that his company would be making a significant donation to the hospital's emergency fund. As the day progressed, Frank began to regain consciousness and strength. The warm hospital environment and proper medical care had worked wonders, and he was finally able to speak clearly. Sarah was at his bedside when he fully came to, and the first thing he did was grab her hand with surprising strength. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "I don't even know your name, but you saved my life." Sarah introduced herself properly for the first time, and Frank smiled in a way that transformed his entire face. She could see past the weathered exterior to the person he must have been as a young soldier. As they talked, Frank began to share his story. He had been living alone in a small apartment about 6 blocks from where Sarah found him. He had been walking to the VA clinic for his regular appointment when he slipped on the ice and fell. The combination of the injury, the cold, and his unmanaged diabetes had created a perfect storm that could have been fatal. But there was more to Frank's story than a simple medical emergency. As Sarah listened, she learned that Frank Washington was not just any veteran. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic, saving countless lives under fire. After returning home, he had worked as an EMT for 30 years before retiring. The irony was not lost on either of them that the Man who had spent his entire life helping others in emergencies had needed someone to help him in his own crisis. Frank also revealed something that made Sarah's heart sink. He had no family left. His wife had died from cancer 3 years earlier, and they had never had children. His younger brother, his last remaining relative, had passed away the previous summer. He was essentially alone in the world, which explained why no one had come looking for him when he failed to show up for his VA appointment. As evening approached, local news stations began running the story of Sarah's dramatic rescue. The footage taken by bystanders showed her carefully maneuvering the bulldozer through the snowy streets, and the image of her helping load Frank into the emergency room had already been shared thousands of times on social media. Reporters were calling it everything from the bulldozer angel to Chicago's most heroic nurse. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention. She had simply done what felt right in the moment, and she couldn't understand why people were making such a big deal about it. Anyone would have done the same thing, she insisted during a brief interview with Channel 7 News. But Frank, watching from his hospital bed, shook his head. No, he told the nurse who was checking his vitals. Not everyone would have done what she did. Most people would have called 911 and waited. She saw a problem and solved it, even when the solution seemed impossible. That's special. What neither Sarah nor Frank knew was that the viral video of the rescue had caught the attention of some very important people. Military organizations, veterans groups, and even officials from the Department of Veterans Affairs had taken notice of the story. More importantly, the video had been seen by someone who recognized Frank Washington from a very long time ago. In a suburb of Detroit, retired Army Colonel James Murphy was watching the evening news when Frank's face appeared on screen. Murphy, now 78 years old, leaned forward in his chair and grabbed his wife's arm. "Martha," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I know that man. That's Frankie Washington. He saved my life in Vietnam." Colonel Murphy had been searching for Frank for over 50 years, ever since a mortar attack in 1969 that had separated their unit. Frank had carried the wounded Murphy nearly 2 miles through enemy territory to reach a medical evacuation site, but in the chaos of war, they had lost touch with each other afterward. Murphy had tried many times over the decades to find the man who had saved his life, but without much information to go on, his searches had always come up empty. Now seeing Frank on television, Murphy knew he had finally found his guardian angel. He immediately began making plans to travel to Chicago, determined to thank the man who had given him the chance to live a full life, marry his sweetheart, and raise 3 children. He had no idea that his arrival would set in motion a series of events that would change Frank's life in ways no one could have imagined. 3 days after the rescue, Sarah was just finishing her morning rounds when she noticed an elderly man in an expensive-looking overcoat standing outside Frank's room. He appeared to be in his late 70s, well-dressed and distinguished, but there was something about his posture that suggested military bearing. More importantly, there were tears streaming down his face as he stared through the window at Frank, who was sitting up in bed reading a magazine. Sarah approached the man carefully, thinking he might be lost or confused. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you with something?" she asked gently. The man turned to her, and she could see that his eyes were filled with a mixture of joy and overwhelming emotion. "Is that really Frank Washington in there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Frank Washington who served as a medic in Vietnam with the 82nd Airborne?" Sarah nodded, though she was puzzled about how this stranger knew such specific details about Frank's military service. The man took a deep breath and extended his hand. "I'm James Murphy," he said. "Retired Colonel James Murphy. That man in there saved my life 53 years ago, and I've been looking for him ever since." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as the significance of this moment hit her. She had read enough stories about military bonds to understand how meaningful this reunion would be. Colonel Murphy explained that he had driven straight through the night from Detroit after seeing the news coverage of Frank's rescue. He had barely stopped to eat or sleep, desperate to finally meet the man who had carried him to safety through a jungle filled with enemy soldiers. "I was 19 years old," he told Sarah, "fresh out of basic training and scared out of my mind. Frank was only 21 himself, but he seemed so calm and capable. When that mortar shell exploded near our position, I thought I was going to die in that jungle." Sarah offered to introduce him to Frank, but Colonel Murphy hesitated. "What if he doesn't remember me?" he asked. It was such a long time ago, and he probably saved dozens of soldiers during his tours. I might just be one face among many. Sarah assured him that there was only one way to find out, and she gently knocked on Frank's door before leading the colonel inside. Frank looked up from his magazine when they entered, and for a moment his expression was simply polite curiosity. Then something shifted in his eyes as he really looked at the man standing beside Sarah. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, pure amazement. Jimmy Murphy, Frank said slowly, his voice incredulous. Lieutenant Jimmy Murphy from Pittsburgh? Colonel Murphy's composure finally broke completely, and he rushed to Frank's bedside, grabbing his hand with both of his own. You remember, Colonel Murphy said through his tears. After all these years, you remember? Frank was crying now too, something Sarah hadn't seen him do even during his darkest moments after the rescue. Of course I remember, Frank said. You were the kid who carried pictures of his girlfriend in his helmet. You talked about her constantly. What was her name, Martha? I married her, Colonel Murphy said, laughing and crying at the same time. We've been married for 51 years. We have 3 kids and 8 grandchildren, and it's all because you carried me out of that jungle. The two men embraced as best they could with Frank still in his hospital bed, and Sarah found herself reaching for tissues as her own eyes filled with tears. What followed was an emotional reunion that seemed to energize Frank in a way that medical treatment alone could never accomplish. The two veterans spent hours sharing stories, filling in the gaps of the past 5 decades. Colonel Murphy told Frank about his military career, how he had risen through the ranks and eventually commanded his own battalion. He spoke about his family, his successful business career after leaving the Army, and the comfortable life he had built in suburban Detroit. Frank, in turn, shared his own journey. He talked about finishing his military service and coming home to Chicago, where he had trained as an EMT. He described meeting his late wife, Linda, at a USO dance and how they had built a quiet, happy life together, even though they were never able to have children. He spoke about his 30 years of emergency medical service and how he had tried to honor his military training by continuing to help people in crisis. As they talked, Colonel Murphy began to understand the financial struggles that Frank had been facing. Frank's wife's cancer treatment had consumed most of their savings, and his pension from the city wasn't enough to cover his medical expenses and rent. He had been too proud to seek help from veterans organizations, and his health problems had been getting worse as he tried to manage his diabetes without proper medical care. This revelation sparked something in Colonel Murphy that went far beyond simple gratitude. He had spent decades building a successful engineering consulting firm, and he was now a wealthy man. More importantly, he had never forgotten the debt he owed to Frank, and he had always hoped he would someday be able to repay it. Now finally, he had that chance. Frank, Colonel Murphy said, choosing his words carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. What would you say to coming to live with Martha and me in Detroit? We have a big house, way too big for 2 old people, and Martha has been asking me for years when I was going to find the man who saved my life so she could thank him properly. Frank was stunned by the offer. He had been dreading his discharge from the hospital because it meant returning to his small, lonely apartment and the daily struggle of managing his health on a limited budget. The idea of having a real family again, people who cared about him, seemed almost too good to be true. But Colonel Murphy wasn't finished. I've been successful in business, Frank, and I owe all of it to the fact that you kept me alive long enough to have a life. I want to set up a trust fund that will cover all of your medical expenses for the rest of your life. I want you to never have to worry about money or health care again, and I want you to be part of our family. Sarah watched this conversation from the doorway, barely able to contain her emotions. In her years as a nurse, she had seen many touching moments between patients and their families, but this felt different. This was a demonstration of how one act of kindness, whether it happened 50 years ago or 3 days ago, could ripple through time and change everything. Frank was overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, but he was also a proud man who had always stood on his own 2 feet. Jimmy, he said finally, you don't owe me anything. We were soldiers together. We looked out for each other. That's what you do. But Colonel Murphy shook his head firmly. You're wrong about that, Frank. I owe you everything. My wife, my children, my grandchildren, my career, every good day I've had for the past 50 years. All of it exists because you didn't leave me behind in that jungle. Now please let me do this for you." Word of Colonel Murphy's reunion with Frank spread quickly through the hospital, and soon the local media picked up on this incredible twist to an already amazing story. The narrative of Sarah's heroic rescue had now evolved into something even more compelling, a story about how acts of kindness and heroism can echo across decades, connecting lives in the most unexpected ways. Martha Murphy arrived the next day, having driven from Detroit with a car full of homemade food and photo albums, documenting the life that Frank's heroism had made possible. She was a petite woman in her 70s with silver hair and bright blue eyes that sparkled with warmth. The moment she met Frank, she wrapped him in a hug that seemed to convey 50 years of gratitude. "Frank Washington," she said, holding his face in her hands. "I have been praying to meet you for over half a century. Every birthday my husband celebrated, every anniversary we shared, every time we watched our children grow up, I thanked God for the unknown soldier who brought my Jimmy home to me." Frank was moved beyond words by her sincerity and grace. Martha had brought photo albums spanning 5 decades, and she spent hours showing Frank pictures of the life he had helped make possible. There were wedding photos, images of Colonel Murphy graduating from various military schools, pictures of their 3 children as babies, toddlers, teenagers, and adults. There were photos from family vacations, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, and graduations, an entire lifetime of joy and love that existed because Frank had refused to leave a wounded soldier behind. As Frank looked through these albums, something profound happened to him. For the first time since his wife Linda had died, he began to feel like he had a purpose again. Seeing the happiness and success of the Murphy family didn't make him jealous or sad about what he had missed in his own life. Instead, it filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction and meaning. His actions in Vietnam had mattered in ways he had never imagined. Sarah had been watching these developments with growing amazement. What had started as a simple medical emergency was turning into something that felt almost magical. She found herself spending her breaks in Frank's room, listening to the stories being shared between the old soldiers and marveling at how their chance encounter in the snow had led to this incredible reunion. Dr. Chen approached Sarah during one of her shifts with news that would add another layer of complexity to an already remarkable situation. "Sarah," she said, "I've been contacted by the Chicago Tribune. They want to do a major feature story about everything that's happened here, but they're also asking about you. They want to know more about the nurse who started all of this." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention, but Dr. Chen continued, "There's something else. The hospital board met yesterday, and they want to recognize what you did. They're talking about establishing a new emergency response protocol based on your quick thinking, and they want to create an award in your name for healthcare workers who go above and beyond in crisis situations." The recognition was flattering, but Sarah found herself more interested in what was happening between Frank and the Murphy family. She had learned that Colonel Murphy had been serious about his offer to Frank, and legal papers were already being drawn up to establish the medical trust fund. More importantly, Frank had agreed to move to Detroit once he was discharged from the hospital. But there was still one more surprise waiting for everyone involved. On Frank's final day in the hospital, a group of visitors arrived that no one had expected. Through the hospital's front doors walked a delegation of veterans from the local VFW post, led by a man named Robert Chen, Dr. Chen's father. As it turned out, Robert Chen was a Vietnam veteran himself, and when he had seen the news coverage of Frank's rescue and subsequent reunion with Colonel Murphy, he had done some research. What he discovered was that Frank Washington was something of a legend among Vietnam medics. Through military records and veteran networks, Robert had found documentation of Frank's extraordinary service record. Frank had been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Bronze Star with V device for heroic achievement, and the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. More importantly, military records showed that Frank had been directly responsible for saving the lives of at least 47 soldiers during his 2 tours in Vietnam. Many of these men had gone on to have families and successful careers, creating a ripple effect of life and happiness that could be traced back to Frank's heroism. "Frank," Robert Chen said as he presented him with a framed compilation of his military records, "we had no idea we had a genuine war hero living quietly in our city. The VFW wants to make you an honorary lifetime member, and we've established a scholarship fund in your name for the children and grandchildren of Chicago emergency responders. Frank was overwhelmed by this recognition, but what moved him most was learning about the other lives he had saved. Over the following days, as word spread through veteran networks, Frank began receiving letters and phone calls from soldiers he had treated in Vietnam, or from their children and grandchildren. Each contact reinforced the impact his service had made and helped him understand that his entire life had been meaningful in ways he had never realized. Sarah watched all of this unfold with a sense of wonder that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Her impulsive decision to commandeer a bulldozer to save a stranger had set in motion a series of events that seemed almost too incredible to be real. Frank had gone from being a lonely, struggling veteran to being surrounded by love, recognition, and financial security. On the day Frank was discharged, the hospital lobby was filled with people who had come to see him off. There were his new family members, the Murphys, who would be driving him to his new home in Detroit. There were fellow veterans who had come to honor his service. There were hospital staff members who had been touched by his story. And there were local residents who had been inspired by the tale of heroism, kindness, and unexpected connections. As Frank prepared to leave, he took Sarah aside for a private moment. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice serious and filled with emotion. "What you did for me wasn't just about saving my life that day in the snow. You gave me back my purpose. You reminded me that I matter, that my life has had meaning. I was ready to give up, but you wouldn't let me." Sarah hugged him tightly, realizing that this experience had changed her as profoundly as it had changed him. She had learned that sometimes the most extraordinary things can grow from the simplest acts of human kindness. She had also learned that we are all more connected than we realize, and that the good we do can echo through time in ways we might never know about. As Frank's car pulled away from the hospital, heading toward his new life with the Murphy family, Sarah stood at the window watching until it disappeared into traffic. She had no way of knowing that the story was still far from over, and that the most surprising chapter was yet to come. 6 months after Frank's discharge from the hospital, Sarah received a phone call that would lead to the most unexpected chapter of this remarkable story. The caller was Martha Murphy, and her voice was filled with an excitement that immediately caught Sarah's attention. "Sarah, dear," Martha said, "I hope you don't mind me calling, but something absolutely incredible has happened, and James and I wanted you to be the first to know." Sarah settled into a chair in her apartment, curious about what news could have Martha so animated. "You remember how we told you that Frank has been adjusting so wonderfully to life here with us?" Martha continued. "Well, he's been volunteering at the local VA hospital, sharing his experiences with younger veterans who are struggling with their transitions back to civilian life. The work has been incredibly fulfilling for him." Sarah smiled, pleased to hear that Frank had found another way to help people. It seemed perfectly in character for him to turn his own difficult experiences into a source of support for others. But Martha's voice suggested there was much more to the story. "Last week," Martha said, "Frank was working with a young veteran named David Rodriguez, who served in Afghanistan. David has been having a terrible time adjusting to life after the military, and he was pretty resistant to counseling or help of any kind. But something about Frank's approach got through to him." Sarah listened intently as Martha explained how Frank's combination of military experience and medical knowledge had made him uniquely effective at connecting with struggling veterans. Unlike traditional counselors, Frank understood both the trauma of combat and the practical challenges of dealing with physical and emotional wounds. "But here's the truly amazing part," Martha continued. "David's counseling sessions with Frank were so successful that the VA hospital asked Frank to consider developing a formal program. They want him to train other veteran volunteers to provide peer counseling using his methods." This news was wonderful, but Sarah sensed that Martha was building up to something even bigger. She was right. Martha took a deep breath before continuing with the most surprising part of her story. "The Department of Veterans Affairs has been watching Frank's work here in Detroit, and they've offered him a position as a national consultant. They want him to travel around the country, setting up similar programs at VA hospitals and training centers. Sarah, they're offering him a salary that's more than he ever made as an EMT, and the work would allow him to help thousands of veterans across the nation." Sarah was thrilled for Frank, But she was also puzzled about why Martha was calling her specifically with this news. The answer came with Martha's next words. Frank has agreed to take the position, but he has one condition. He wants you to be part of the program. Sarah nearly dropped the phone in surprise. Me? She asked. What could I possibly contribute to a veterans program? Martha laughed warmly. Oh, my dear, you have no idea how much you've already contributed. Frank has been telling everyone about your quick thinking and decisive action during his rescue. But more than that, he's been talking about your natural ability to see what people need and find creative solutions to help them. The offer, as Martha explained it, was for Sarah to serve as a medical consultant for the program, helping to design protocols for recognizing and addressing the healthcare needs of veterans who might not be getting adequate care through traditional channels. Her nursing background, combined with her demonstrated ability to think outside the box in crisis situations, made her an ideal candidate for the position. Frank says that what made his rescue so successful wasn't just that you saw someone who needed help, Martha explained. It was that you assessed the situation, identified the real problems, and found an unconventional solution that actually worked. That's exactly the kind of thinking this program needs. Sarah was stunned by the offer, but she was also intrigued. The idea of working with Frank again, and of using her skills to help veterans on a national scale, was incredibly appealing. However, she had concerns about leaving her position at St. Mary's Hospital, where she felt she was making a real difference in her patients' lives. When she expressed these concerns to Martha, the response was even more surprising than the original offer. Actually, Martha said, the program would be headquartered right there in Chicago. The VA chose your city partly because of the success of Frank's initial rescue and the positive media attention it generated. You wouldn't have to leave your current job entirely. You could work part-time with the program while maintaining your nursing position at the hospital. Over the following weeks, Sarah learned more about the scope and vision of the new program. It would be called the Rapid Response Veterans Support Initiative, and it would focus on identifying veterans who were falling through the cracks of the existing support system. The program would train teams of veteran volunteers and healthcare professionals to provide immediate, on-the-spot assistance to veterans in crisis. The more Sarah learned about the program, the more excited she became. It represented a chance to take the improvised problem-solving approach that had worked so well with Frank and turn it into a systematic method for helping veterans across the country. The program would combine traditional medical care with innovative outreach methods, peer counseling, and rapid response protocols. Frank called her personally to discuss the opportunity, and hearing his voice filled with enthusiasm and purpose was incredibly moving. Sarah, he said, I've found my calling again, and it's all because you refused to walk past someone who needed help. This program could save lives, but I need someone I trust to help me build it right. I need someone who understands that sometimes the best way to help people is to break a few rules. The reference to rule breaking made Sarah laugh, remembering her unauthorized use of the bulldozer. But Frank's point was serious. The existing systems for helping veterans, while well-intentioned, were often bureaucratic and slow to respond. The new program would emphasize rapid assessment and creative problem-solving, qualities that Sarah had demonstrated during Frank's rescue. After much consideration and discussion with her supervisors at St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah decided to accept the position. The hospital administration was not only supportive of her involvement with the program, but they also saw it as an opportunity to enhance their own reputation for innovative healthcare delivery. They agreed to a flexible schedule that would allow Sarah to split her time between the hospital and the veterans program. The announcement of Sarah's involvement in the Rapid Response Veterans Support Initiative generated significant media attention. The story of the nurse who had used a bulldozer to save a veteran and who was now helping to revolutionize veteran care on a national level captured the public's imagination. News outlets from across the country requested interviews, and Sarah found herself becoming an unexpected spokesperson for innovative approaches to healthcare and veteran support. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Bob Harrison, the construction company owner whose bulldozer Sarah had borrowed, approached her with a business proposition. His company wanted to partner with the Veterans Program by providing emergency transportation and equipment when needed. He had been so moved by Sarah's story that he had developed an entire division of his business dedicated to emergency response services for veterans, and other vulnerable populations as Sarah prepared for her new role. She reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that snowy February morning when she had stopped to help a stranger. What had begun as a simple act of human kindness had evolved into a career opportunity that would allow her to help thousands of people. More importantly, it had taught her that the smallest decisions can have the most profound consequences, and that we never know when our actions might change not just our own lives, but the lives of countless others. 2 years after that fateful February morning, Sarah stood before an audience of 500 healthcare professionals and veterans advocates at the National Conference on Emergency Medical Response. She was there to present the results of the Rapid Response Veteran Support Initiative, and the numbers she was about to share would have seemed impossible to believe just a few years earlier. The program that had grown from Frank's rescue had now helped over 3,000 veterans across 12 major cities. The combination of rapid medical assessment, peer counseling, and creative problem-solving had proven remarkably effective at reaching veterans who had been struggling to access traditional support services. Most importantly, the program had prevented an estimated 47 veteran suicides and had helped hundreds of others get back on their feet both medically and financially. As Sarah looked out at the audience, she spotted familiar faces that reminded her of the journey that had brought her to this moment. Frank was sitting in the front row, now serving as the program's national director and looking healthier and more vibrant than he had in years. Beside him sat Colonel and Martha Murphy, who had become like surrogate parents to both Frank and Sarah. Dr. Chen from St. Mary's Hospital was there, representing the growing number of medical institutions that had partnered with the program. But perhaps most meaningful to Sarah was the presence of dozens of veterans who had been helped by the program over the past 2 years. These men and women represented every branch of the military and every era of American conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Each had a story of crisis, intervention, and recovery that echoed the themes of Frank's original rescue. When I started a construction bulldozer that morning in Chicago, Sarah began her presentation, drawing laughter from the audience. I had no idea I was beginning a journey that would teach me so much about the power of human connection and the importance of refusing to give up on people who need help. She went on to describe the evolution of the program, explaining how Frank's insights about veteran psychology had been combined with rapid medical assessment techniques to create intervention protocols that were both efficient and deeply personal. The key innovation had been the recognition that veterans often responded better to help from other veterans who understood their experiences, particularly when that help was delivered quickly and without bureaucratic delays. The presentation included video testimonials from veterans who had been helped by the program, and there wasn't a dry eye in the audience as these men and women described how timely intervention had literally saved their lives. One veteran from Denver talked about how a rapid response team had found him living in his car during a snowstorm, struggling with untreated diabetes and severe depression. Another from Miami described how peer counselors had helped her navigate the VA system after she had given up on getting the mental health support she needed. But the most powerful testimony came from David Rodriguez, the young veteran whose successful counseling with Frank had sparked the creation of the national program. David had not only recovered from his own struggles, but had become one of the program's most effective peer counselors, helping dozens of other veterans in the Detroit area. Frank Washington saved my life, David told the audience, but Sarah Martinez created the system that allowed him to save many more lives. This program works because it treats veterans like human beings instead of case numbers, and because it understands that sometimes the best help comes from someone who has walked the same path. As the conference continued over 3 days, Sarah was amazed by the interest and enthusiasm from healthcare professionals across the country. Representatives from major hospital systems, VA facilities, and emergency medical services organizations wanted to implement similar programs in their communities. The model that had started with one nurse's split-second decision was now being studied and replicated nationwide. On the final day of the conference, Sarah received news that would mark another turning point in her extraordinary journey. The National Association of Emergency Medical Professionals announced that she was being awarded their highest honor for innovation in emergency medical care. The award recognized not just her dramatic rescue of Frank, but her subsequent work in developing new approaches to veteran crisis intervention. But even more significant was the announcement that came later that day from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The success of the Rapid Response Veteran Support Initiative had convinced federal officials to make it a permanent part of the VA's national strategy for veteran care. The program would receive substantial federal funding and would be expanded to cover 50 major cities within the next 5 years. Frank was asked to speak at the conference's closing ceremony, and his words captured the profound impact that Sarah's initial act of kindness had created. 2 years ago, I was a forgotten old soldier, struggling alone and ready to give up, he said. Today, I'm part of a movement that's changing how our nation cares for its veterans. All of this happened because one person decided that a stranger's life was worth the risk of breaking a few rules. He paused, looking directly at Sarah in the audience. Sarah Martinez taught me that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. It's about seeing someone who needs help and refusing to walk away, even when the solution seems impossible. As the conference ended, Sarah found herself reflecting on the incredible chain of events that had started with her decision to stop for an injured man in the snow. That single act had reunited 2 old soldiers after 50 years, created a national program that was saving lives across the country, and launched her own career in directions she never could have imagined. But perhaps the most important lesson she had learned was about the interconnectedness of human lives and the lasting impact of kindness. The veterans who are now getting help through the program would go on to have their own impacts on their families and communities. Children and grandchildren would benefit from having healthier, happier veterans in their lives. The ripple effects of that February morning would continue expanding for generations. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter that perfectly captured the ongoing impact of her story. It came from a 10-year-old girl named Emma in Portland, Oregon. Emma's grandfather was a veteran who had been helped by the Rapid Response Program after a crisis that had left him hospitalized and despondent. The program's intervention had not only addressed his immediate medical needs, but had connected him with other veterans and given him a new sense of purpose. Emma's letter was simple but profound. Dear Miss Sarah, thank you for saving my grandpa. I know you didn't save him directly, but my mom told me that everything started with you helping that man in the snow. My grandpa is happy now, and he tells me stories about the Army and teaches me how to fix things. He says that good people like you are why he fought for our country. I want to be like you when I grow up and help people too. Reading that letter, Sarah understood that her story was really about much more than one dramatic rescue or even one successful program. It was about the fundamental human capacity for compassion and the extraordinary things that can happen when ordinary people decide to act on that compassion, regardless of the obstacles or risks involved. Today, Frank Washington continues his work as National Director of the Rapid Response Veteran Support Initiative, having found new purpose and family in his later years. The program has now helped over 10,000 veterans and has been adopted as a model for emergency intervention programs in other countries. Sarah Martinez remains both a practicing nurse and a national consultant on innovative healthcare delivery, proof that one person's decision to help a stranger can indeed change the world in ways no one could have predicted.